Hello and welcome to Read Brave, a community-built comics podcast from the Graphomania Podcast Network. I'm Vinton Bain, and today I am joined by my friend Emily Savidge. Which, have I ever told you how awesome your name is?
I had a professor tell me that in college.
I mean, I've grown up with the name Bain, and people think that's pretty awesome, especially in the comic book world. But Savidge, that's cool.
Yeah, I had an English professor who called everyone by their last names, and every time he said my name, he would just kind of growl it. It was in the history of English language, so
I like it.
yeah, it's okay.
So we're going to start off the podcast the way we usually do around here with what we have been reading recently. Emily, since you have never been on the podcast, this could mean anything for you. And I know that you wrote some things down. So
yes, I did.
Share with us. What have you been reading?
Okay, well, last night, right before I went to bed, after a very long day of doing absolutely nothing, I read the new Hulk by Tamaki.
Yep. I
Number
assume
7.
That's the way you pronounce it. I've never had to pronounce it, so.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Had a little appearance by Hellcat, which I knew about because you had said something.
Yeah.
And I read the new Miss Marvel, which that's been very interesting.
Both good. Yeah, I really appreciated the Hellcat cameo in the Hulk book. I always want to say She-Hulk, but it's actually Hulk, and I do appreciate that a lot. But it is about Jennifer Walters' She-Hulk. So it's kind of throwing me through a loop. They've made her into a gray Hulk to deal with some emotional trauma that she had to deal with. And it's been interesting to see where that series is going as she's trying to figure out what's going on inside of her. And I love that Patsy Walker stopped by to check on her.
Yeah, it was awesome because I obviously the first time I ever saw, well, for my newbie status, first time I ever saw Jennifer was in the Patsy Walker Hellcat series last year, and she's always just green, walking around, seeming totally normal.
I mean, that's the way she's been pretty much since she was introduced. I can't think of, surely there's been something that's happened that's changed her color at some other point. I'm not remembering it right now, though, and that's perfectly fine.
I also read the new Defenders #1 the day it came out.
I have still not read this. I saw you were reading it, and I really wanted to know what you were thinking because I was trying to decide whether I was going to read it or not because usually I have way too many things to read.
Yeah, I wasn't sure, and then I went into my only comic book store in my city, and I asked them if they had heard anything about it, and they said they heard it was awesome, but hadn't read it. So I said, well, add it to my pull list, and I went over and grabbed it because, yeah, I have a pull list now, which is weird to me.
I was thinking that I read the new Miss Marvel, but now that I'm thinking of it, I think I just read Secret Warriors with her in it. I don't think I've read the new Miss Marvel. Man, how did I miss that one and the things I haven't read yet? How was that?
It was pretty good. I really like how they introduced all of her cultural everything into it. We see an old person come back. I couldn't remember her name till, thank God, they said it. But yeah, one of her old foes from probably a few issues ago came back. And it's interesting. Basically, well, there's one part when Zoey freaks out about something, and it's funny because out of the entire group of people that she's sitting with, she should not be the one freaking out about being pulled by ice.
I did read this. Okay, I just saw on my Goodreads for some reason. I must have forgot to put it on there. Yeah, because they have people going around picking up immigrants or anyone that they think doesn't belong in the neighborhood, and then she freaks out, but everyone else is perfectly calm around her, and she's with a bunch of colored people and Muslim people that should be afraid of these prejudiced, self-imposed police officers outside, and she's the one that freaks out because it turns out she is French,
yes,
and not American, and she never got her papers.
Yeah, it was funny. I had to, because I saw the panel and I was like, okay, and I just didn't realize it was her that said that, and I went back and I was like, wait, what? And I went back and I was just like, oh, okay, that seems about right for her.
It was pretty fantastic.
Yeah, I really like the series as a whole. I read the first 4 volumes of the, I guess not original, but they rebooted it.
They rebooted the numbers, but the story really kept going on. They didn't really do anything with the story. They stopped for Secret Wars when the whole world changed, and then just picked right back up where they left off with it and kept going. It was kind of like they wanted to ignore it, but had to at least mention it in the numbering because Marvel made them renumber everything.
Okay, yeah, because I read the first 4 volumes all at once because my library had them. So I can't remember when I actually read them in relation to when everything else started up.
Yeah, we are going to be covering the first volume of Miss Marvel on the next episode of Excelsior. I'm pretty excited to look back at that. I haven't actually picked it back up to take notes for it, but it'll be the first time I've reread through it. So I think I'm going to really enjoy rereading it because I really enjoyed it the first time. And now being so far into it, it's kind of cool to go back and then check out the first few issues again in light of everything that has happened thus far.
Yeah, I don't think I think I have a couple of issues here and there that I picked up from Hastings when they went out of business last year.
Yeah.
When everything was down about 25 cents, I was just grabbing anything that seemed interesting.
Handfuls of everything.
Yeah, I'll have to get them out of my library again. But yeah, for Defenders, I wasn't sure if I was going to read it. But then I was reading the most recent Jessica Jones, I think number 9. And they mentioned something about...
There's so many comics.
Yeah, I know. And I always try to read them in little, like, binge read some comics.
Right.
But yeah, they mentioned something about the Defenders in there. And I was like, okay, well, I guess that's happening. Sure. It's pretty good. They just kind of introduce everyone with a big... And it's not really quite a splash page, but just kind of, they're like Jessica Jones and all that sort of stuff. So it was pretty fun. And I like Danny in the comics.
Yeah.
From what I've seen him in a lot of Jessica Jones stuff.
Comics.
I haven't actually watched Iron Fist yet. So in my mind, he's still just awesome.
I didn't hate it as much as everyone else, but it's definitely the weakest of them. And they did a lot of things wrong, I think, in my opinion. So
it's on the list to watch once I've run out of other things, which in theory will never happen.
Will probably never happen.
Yeah, but I'm definitely watching the Defenders whenever that premieres.
I am very excited for that.
Jessica Jones was she was my introduction into reading comics last year. No, 2 years ago.
Yeah, you read through Alias, didn't you?
Yeah, I watched, one of my former coworkers was really excited about Jessica Jones, and I said, I don't know what that is. And he told me, he's like, it's in the same world as Daredevil and everything like that. So I watched it and was enthralled within about, 5 seconds. And I loved Kristen Ritter and just loved everything about the series almost immediately. Obviously loved David Tennant. And it was weird because I was watching Jessica Jones at the same time I was watching early Doctor Who. So it was a little bit of whiplash.
Yeah.
But yeah, I absolutely loved her. So I decided to read Alias, and I read probably the first issue maybe 2 months after Jessica Jones came out. And I was kind of like, oh, okay, this is a little different. And I kind of put it down, but I bought the first volume, so I knew I was going to go back and read it. And then I don't think I went back to it until after I just casually wrote on Twitter that I was thinking about dipping my toe into comics probably 4 weeks after I said, I don't think I'm ever going to read comics. And you gave me a long list of things.
Yeah, I can't control myself when it comes to recommendations.
I put that out there in the sole hope that you would be like, hey, you should read this, without actually pestering you for recommendations. That was my goal.
I always feel kind of bad when someone asks me for recommendations because I feel like I just bombard and drown them with recommendations.
I went through everything you recommended over time, and some things I was like, and some things I absolutely loved.
Yeah.
But yeah, I read all of Alias. I read The Pulse. I read a bit of something that they put together of Luke Cage stuff on Comixology.
Okay, yeah.
So Jessica would come in and out of there, and I absolutely love her. So she's a very flawed person, but she was my gateway.
Yeah. I really love when she shows up in cameos in other comics, like in the new Hawkeye that she showed up in recently. That was really fun.
That's my favorite issue. Just because of Kate going through and saying Jessica Jones tip number whatever.
Right.
And yeah, they're a little all over the place. But yeah, those fighting or just doing everything together was awesome. I went through and read/skimmed the first 7 issues. Well, I guess the 7 issues of Hawkeye today before I came over.
Nice.
Because I was eating my lunch. And I was like, God, I love these so much.
It's so hard for me to believe that there's only 7 issues. I feel like I've now been reading this run of Hawkeye for a long time, but it's only 7 issues.
Yeah, it was crazy as I was going back, and I was like, oh, this is a lot like tighter than I thought it was. Because I remember I read the first issue over Christmas because I have something that my sister spilled on it while I was home for Christmas. So I pulled out the first issue and I was like, oh, right. Yeah, that happened. So that was back in December. And I think I picked that up right before I left to go see my family.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've packed a lot of stuff in there and kind of just eased from one arc into the other.
Right. And it's all been building to where we left off on issue 7, her basically tracking down her dad and coming down to this big confrontation of sorts. And issue 7 was maybe my favorite one yet. The wit in that book is just all throughout it is so perfect. Like in my review, I put in the panel where she goes in like really upset and really stern and talking to this policewoman detective friend of hers, acquaintance, who doesn't like working with her and wish she would leave her alone. And then the detective is like, I'm surprised you didn't bring any of your wit, because she's all downtrodden. And she just turns with a big smile and says, I'm surprised you weren't like throwing finger guns. And she says, how dare you malign finger guns, Rivera? They are the best of all guns, and I will never have a bad enough day that's not true.
Yep, that was one of the things I took a picture of as I was flipping through today. I love that. I love her relationship with Rivera.
Yeah, it's so great. And then there was a panel in this where there's a fight scene where she's running through a lobby with a pool, and she's fighting all these guys. And of course they have it split into multiple panels, but it's one wide shot showing like the one area, but it's split so that they can have her in multiple panels doing multiple different things, fighting the guys as they come in. And there's like one shadow that's slowly rising up as a guy walks down this like catwalk to shoot her. And it's the way that it's orchestrated is maybe perhaps one of the most perfectly put together panels, just in design and layout. Like I can't even get my mind to comprehend what's happening necessarily in a way that I could recreate it.
Yeah, it was awesome. And then she gets so mad that someone threw her in the pool and stole her idea.
She was like, I was going to throw you in that pool.
Oh, it was funny. Yeah, I really like that issue because, especially after going back today with the whole thing with Madame Mask, I was like, oh, that wasn't even in this Hawkeye. Mm-hmm. That was in the other Hawkeye, right. Which I read the first 3 volumes of that. I have the 4th one I bought when Amazon went a little crazy a couple weeks ago and put everything on sale. Yeah. So that's still in my to read list. Things. Yeah, that was crazy. I bought so many comics that night. I went through and I bought pretty much everything you guys recommended, more or less. Not everything. That sounded good. And then I was just kind of like, oh, this is on my to read list. And I was like, yeah, $1.60, it's fine. And after I was like, oh yeah, I just bought like $60 worth of comics. That's fine.
Well, you probably got like $600 worth of comics.
Crazy. So. Yeah, I love a good deal when it comes to books of any kind. So yeah, I'm still working through those. That actually leads into one of the other things I've been reading recently, which is Spider-Woman, Volume 1. Right, yeah. And she's super pregnant on the front.
Super pregnant.
Yeah, because I was reading, I don't even know what, but a very pregnant Jessica came through, and I was like, I don't think that's Jessica Jones. Like, I knew Jessica was pregnant at one point with Danielle, right. But I was like, I don't, and then they said Jessica Drew, and I was like, I don't know who that is, which now feels silly because of course I know who she is.
Yeah, I can see the confusion, especially if you're newer to it and you're not as familiar with the characters. Jessica Drew, Jessica Jones.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, just after a couple months, I'm like, I feel like I know so many more characters. I'm like, how did I not know who that person was? But yeah, I read the first maybe issue or 2 of that. I was like right before I went to bed a couple of nights ago. And I really, really like her too, because she's kind of,
Yeah, that comic is so much fun. Just the idea of having a pregnant superhero, a super pregnant superhero, just still fighting and like dealing with pregnancy at the same time. I think it's within the first few issues that she is out in space in the pregnancy ward. It's so fantastic.
Yeah, I think I think I left off there, maybe. Yeah, she's just like on the phone. Was it Captain Marvel that she was on the phone with?
Yep.
Yeah, she's just sitting there, destroying people and on the phone at the same time chatting. I can't multitask that well at all.
While being super pregnant.
Yeah, I know. I can't even imagine.
I'm pretty sure if I was super pregnant, I wouldn't be walking, let alone fighting crime and destroying aliens.
Yeah, probably just crying a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I also, something I'd been meaning to read, actually, ever since I saw him on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, so that goes back, was I've been reading March, John Lewis's graphic novel. So I read the first book. It's very good. He's kind of, pretty awesome. So it's been interesting reading that. It's all in black and white. It's cool.
Yeah.
History.
Black and white comics can sometimes be so much better than color comics and the drama that they bring to the artistic style.
Yeah. So it was really awesome. It's pretty heavy. So I read through, I think, the first book over the course of a couple of days. I was like, oh, okay, we'll come back to this, but I really loved it. It's a difficult time in history, but really interesting to see he's getting a story out.
Yeah.
Again. So I think that's pretty much it, aside from just, all the awesome things I've read over the past year since I decided this is going to be a thing.
All right. Well, as for me, aside from the things we've already mentioned, I read the new issue of Black Bolt #2. He's still imprisoned in this issue and dealing more with Crusher Creel. And I really liked when Crusher Creel found out his real name. Do you know what Black Bolt's real name is?
No.
It is Blackagar Boltagon, which is exactly what Creel's response is. And I really resonated with that. I was like, I'm glad we're making fun of that name because that name deserves to be made fun of.
Oh, that's funny.
That's pretty much the only comment I have on that because that's just true. I do have a small complaint real quick to make about the comic, which I try not to do too much on the podcast, but it really bothered me. I picked up Secret Empire Brave New World, and the reason I picked it up is because Miles Morales, Carol Danvers, and T'Challa were all on the cover.
Oh.
And there is 6 people on the cover of this comic. 2 of them, I think, show up in the comic.
What?
The other 4 do not. All 3 of the ones I picked up the comic for, nowhere inside the comic.
In just this issue?
Really bothered me. Yeah, in this issue.
Okay.
This really bothered me a lot. I was like, why would you put these characters on the cover if they're not on the cover? And the reason why they did was so I would pick it up. That's exactly why they did it. They won this round. So moving on from there, I did want to briefly mention the Vision Director's Cut issue number 1 has come out. We've mentioned this a couple times on the podcast before. This is issue 1 and 2 of Vision, but with a ton of special features behind the scenes, scripts pages, sketch pages, different ideas that they had going into it, and interviews and that type of thing. It is spectacular. It's a little pricey, but it's 2 issues put together plus a bunch of bonus features. So it's 80 pages, which is almost 3 times bigger than your normal comic for about twice the price of a normal comic. So you get what you pay for sure and more. But yeah, it's fantastic. It's exactly everything I'd hoped it would be. And I kind of hope that they put all these out in one trade thing instead of doing them in these single issues alone, because I would like to just have that in one single collection I could loan out.
Yeah.
I lied. I have 2 complaints. X-Men Blue has been good. I like Cullen Bunn. I like this team for X-Men Blue. What I don't like is that they keep adding new Wolverines to the Marvel Universe, and we have enough Wolverines. And I wish that Scarlet Witch would show up and just yell, "No more Wolverines," because Laura is the only Wolverine that we need. And that's all I have to say about X-Men Blue for this episode. I also read All New Wolverine number 21, and this issue was really, really fantastic. So I think this is the 3rd part of the story that we've been getting, where there's this disease that is spread out, and we've learned that Laura Kinney is somehow the cure for it, and she is trying to save this island. And Deadpool shows up in this one, and more recently, I used to be a huge Deadpool fan, but more recently, anytime Deadpool shows up in something, I'm just irritated by him, and I'm like, okay, this is enough. I've had enough. He's everywhere. He's the new Wolverine. We get it. And he's a little overplayed for me. And he's written to an extreme quite usually. And here he showed up, and I really appreciated the way that they wrote him. They had him talking with Gabby at one point about Old Man Logan, and Old Man Logan apologizes to Laura about what happened before, and Deadpool leans over to Gabby and says, "What happened before?" And she says, "He sort of killed me." And he's like, "No." And she says, "Yeah, stabbed me right through the chest." "No." "And he's kind of my grandpa." "No." It was fantastic. I love that moment. But then there's a moment where he has to take off his costume, because the only way to bring this cure is to let people touch you when you have a healing factor, because it's attracted to your healing factor, and your healing factor deals with it. So he has to take off his costume, and he tells Gabby she should look away. And she's like, "Why?" And he's like, "You might not like what you see. It's not pretty." And she's like, "Oh, I have scars too," and shows him her scars, and they become friends over their scars. And he's like, "Your scars are beautiful." And she's like, "Your scars are beautiful." And I was like, this is such a sweet moment. Aww. I never knew that I wanted a Deadpool and Gabby team up. This is beautiful. So that really, really surprised me. And All New Wolverine continues to be one of the best series that Marvel is doing. I love it so much. Thank you, Tom Taylor, for your exquisite writing.
Yeah, that's on my very long list of things I need to read.
I also read the newest issue of Invincible Iron Man with Ryrie Williams. Again, so perfect. This series has been going on, doing just every issue better and better for me. And this one, the only thing I could say was Ryrie is a sweet, perfect cinnamon roll. She's also an undeniable badass, but there's these great cutbacks to her history, these flashbacks in the issue of her being younger in school. And there's this moment where she's talking to her teacher and she says, "I want to be a scientist." And her teacher's like, "Okay, you can do that." And she's like, "What? You're supposed to tell me I can't." And she's like, "Why would I do that?" She's like, and she shows her like the astronaut from, oh man, what was that movie? Hidden Figures. Whose name I can't remember at the moment. But she says, because that's what they told her, that she wanted to be a scientist, and she couldn't. She's like, "Well, because of people like her, it's not weird for a woman to be a scientist anymore. That's not something that I can tell you can't be. You can absolutely be a scientist. That's a possibility." And she's like, "Well, I was kind of hoping you would tell me no, so I'd have some kind of motivation." And she just kind of stares at the teacher, and she's just like, "What do you want from me?" And she finally is like, "Okay, you can't be Tony Stark." And she's like, "I'm totally going to be Tony Stark, except that weird facial hair."
Yeah, the look on her teacher's face when she's like rolls her eyes, I'm like, okay. Yeah, I haven't read that yet, but I saw that panel when you posted it.
And it cuts straight from there to her flying in the Iron Man suit, which is so perfect, because she's like, she did become Tony Stark. They, in my opinion, much better Tony Stark.
I love
we don't
Tony
need Tony
Stark.
Stark anymore. We have the much better Tony Stark. The only non-Marvel
Politely
thing.
disagree.
Well, the only non-Marvel thing I read since last episode, which is really speaking badly, because I have like 12 non-Marvel things on my list to read that I fell behind on. Sorry, guys. It's been busy. That's why I didn't release an episode last week. Was Batman, the beginning of the War of Jokes and Riddles story. And this story was really fascinating. All I can really say about it is I'm really fascinated and very intrigued by the setup that we got in this issue. They're setting up this story that seems to be maybe a flashback to a previous time in Batman history. I don't know if it's going to connect to anything we've actually gotten in Batman, or if they're going to be like, this is a lost story that he's never told anyone, that we've never had published, but it's from his history. So it's really interesting. It does obviously involve the Riddler and the Joker really heavily, and it's beautiful, just as beautiful as all of Tom King's stuff so far. Of course, this one isn't as impactful because it is all set up for something to come next issue or in the coming issues. So it's hard to measure it when it comes to the ones that came before it, because the past few issues of the Tom King run have been some of the best Batman I've ever read. But this looks like it's setting up something even better and bigger that I've come to expect from Tom King.
Cool.
And that's all that I've read the past few weeks, except for what I will recommend later in the episode, because I think I've learned not to talk too much about what I'm going to recommend, because I get time to recommendations. I'm like, I already talked about it. Bye, guys.
Yeah, I talked ad nauseum about what I plan on recommending, so that's fine.
Well, one of us can talk about something, their recommendations. So now we've come to the part of the show where we can talk about something besides what we've been reading this week. And I would like to talk about how excited I am for Spider-Man Homecoming.
I'm so excited.
Have you seen the reviews that have been coming through? So I should rephrase that, because there haven't been actual reviews, but people have been tweeting about it, reactions, because they can't say too much because the
embargo hasn't been lifted.
Yeah, hasn't been lifted. But some of the tweets they've been saying, they're saying it's a delight. They can hardly wait. Some of them are saying it's the best superhero movie ever. It's the best Spider-Man movie ever. It's the best Spider-Man movie since Spider-Man 2. I'll take that, because Spider-Man 2 was pretty darn good. But people are really saying this is stepping up the game. And I mean, one person did say my new favorite superhero movie of all time, which is big praise. That's a lot. But they're just praising it left and right. I don't think I've seen a single negative comment. Of course, not everyone's giving it like a perfect 5-star review, but 4.5, 90%, not so bad.
Absolutely.
Especially for a series that has had such lows. And had such a roller coaster ride of trying to get it together. And of course, now that we have him in Marvel, he showed up in the Civil War, and we had all these high expectations. I'm sure no one is walking into this movie with super low expectations after seeing Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely. I think getting a little taste of him in Civil War was absolutely amazing, because I didn't realize that he was the Peter Parker / Spider-Man that I wanted and needed.
Yeah.
Until I saw him in there. And, from the very first second that they started playing, was Alt J in the show. His neighborhood, it was just, I was like, oh man, this is gonna be amazing. Spider-Man was my first true love when it comes to superheroes of any kind, back when the first movie came out when I was in high school. Yeah,
mine too. Spider-Man has always been like, the X-Men will always be my team, but Spider-Man will always be my hero. And I just love everything Spider-Man. But the problem with that is that I'm not always happy with what they do with the comics, and I'm not always happy with what they do with the movies. And so it makes it hard to be a fan and really love something when all around you, the media that they're producing for it currently, it doesn't line up. It doesn't match up to what you expect from it, or what your nostalgic view of it was. And so now seeing that they're doing something right with it, something that actually does resonate with me, I'm really, really, really excited. And I heard there's 4 post-credit scenes, like there was in Guardians. So they're going to be
there's
just
5 in Guardians.
Well, yeah.
Including one with Sylvester Stallone.
Littering it through, which I think is a really good idea. That with Guardians, it really kept me captivated to the credits. Like I just was zoned in reading every credit, because some of them changed to We Are Groot. And so it made me want to read everything and see everything and not miss any Easter eggs. This is the way to do credits. Don't just throw up a black screen and some white letters and expect me to pay attention.
Yeah. Ever since I discovered that going to the movies by yourself is super awesome, because you don't have to coordinate with other people, I've sat through the entire credits of every movie that I've been to, including when I saw Beauty and the Beast 4 times, twice by myself. I sat through the entire credits.
I don't ever go to the movies by myself, but I often go with just my wife, and we go at like weird times. So we'll go like at 1:00 on a Wednesday. Theater's empty because no one's there on the 1:00 on a Wednesday. You're getting cheaper prices. There's no one around. There's no one talking during the movie. You just have it all to yourself, and it's so nice.
I am so excited for Spider-Man. And I didn't really read Spider-Man well, I didn't really read any comics growing up, but I didn't realize how good I think Tom Holland is going to be until I was reading Spidey, which you recommended to me last year. And I read through a few issues, and then was it Spidey where he sees Captain America? And he's sitting there talking to himself, and then he just makes squinty eyes, and he's like, I am the worst. I can't remember.
I don't remember.
I can't remember because I've
It's been
read
a while.
so
I remember
many.
that panel, but I don't remember what it was in.
Yeah, because I screen kept that and stuck it on my Instagram because I thought it was hilarious. just all reading all sorts of things with him in it and his little ongoing commentary about everything. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, Tom Holland's got this.
Yeah, and I really like that they have him in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because one of my favorite things about Spider-Man that they've done with him, even since the very beginning, if you go back to some of the very first Spider-Man issues, is he is constantly meeting up and interacting with the other heroes in the Marvel Universe. He's never by himself. He's a street level hero who is constantly like running into the Fantastic Four, hanging out with the X-Men, teaching a class for the X-Men, doing all those types of things, being an Avenger. And so while he is never a complete member of any of those teams, like maybe for a few issues, he will never be like, oh, he is definitely an Avenger. I mean, he is, but he's not what you think of as an Avenger. He's a solo hero who is constantly teaming up.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that with actually other things I've read where all of a sudden, Peter Parker will just waltz in or whatever.
Right.
Or, zoom down very slowly on his web.
Which I've really appreciated that most recently in the main Spider-Man title, Bobby Morris, Mockingbird, has been his team-up partner that's been showing up a lot. So
that sounds pretty awesome.
Really fun. So that being said, there's a little bit of something else movie-wise that we want to talk about, because I just showed you the Black Panther teaser, because when we sat down, you said you hadn't seen it yet. And I said, well, this
for a good reason.
Changed. Yeah, you didn't want to watch it on your phone. I appreciate that. You wanted to watch it on a real screen with some real sound and some real sights.
It deserved to be watched properly.
It did. So having seen it, what are your first reactions?
Michael B. Jordan. I really like him. It looks awesome. Obviously, I mean, you can do pretty much anything with the teaser to make something look pretty awesome.
True.
But I have no doubt that this film would be so good.
Yeah.
Comes out February next year?
I think so.
I think February 2018. Yeah.
I'm bad at dates.
I will be there opening weekend for sure. I love Ryan Coogler. Love Michael B. Jordan. Was that Lupita Nyong'o in it?
I don't know. I'm real bad at actor names.
I think I heard she's in it. I'm terrible at recognizing people when.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I have my wife for that. She's constantly like, that's this person, this is that person, that person was in this. I'm like, I don't know how you remember all this stuff.
Yeah. Seeing both Peter Parker and T'Challa in Civil War, I was just so excited about both of their futures in the movies.
Yeah. I mean, I've said this a million times on multiple podcasts, but being a huge Spider-Man fan, going into Civil War, knowing he was in there, I thought that was just going to blow me away, and that was going to be what I walked away from that film. I walked away from that film a bigger Black Panther fan than I had ever been before. I was so stoked. I was like, I'm excited there's a Spider-Man movie coming, but there's a Black Panther movie coming, guys.
Yeah, I was so excited. I loved him almost immediately. He's very charming and just he's adorable, which is weird to say. It might be because I have the little pop Funko of him, which I bought like the week after I saw Civil War.
An adorable kitty cat.
And so he looks adorable in that. Yeah, I am so excited for Black Panther. I don't know that much about just the comics that go with it as a whole.
Sure.
I think I bought some at some point that are on my very, very long to read list.
I've read quite a bit of Black Panther in the comics, especially when he shows up in other things like Avengers and on team books. I don't know if I would have an answer if somebody asked me what they should read when it comes to Black Panther. I should figure that out.
He was in Miss Marvel recently.
That's true. Yeah, that was a lot of fun, actually. I really liked that issue.
Yeah. That was a weird one-off almost.
Yep, they were like, here's a Miss Marvel comic without Miss Marvel. All in Wakanda.
Yeah. I really don't know what the story is for Black Panther, like what the plot is of the movie or anything really, but I'm there.
Yeah,
for sure.
Me too. I'm totally sold in. That music in that teaser was so good. It really got me pumped.
Yeah.
The way that they flashed the visuals, the way that they slowly revealed just what Wakanda is, and then brought it into all the fighting. It was just perfectly paced. And it was a lot more than I thought we were going to get, because when I hear teaser, I think they're going to show us a couple of flashes of things, bring up the title, tell us the date, and that's going to be it.
Yeah, they should show you a lot of like stills.
This was really like a full trailer. The only thing I think that this was missing, the reason why this was a teaser, is because I'm sure that there are going to be other Avengers that show up in this that we've seen in the movies so far, that they're going to be in this film. They might have even been announced. I'm really bad at keeping up with news for these things because I don't really care that much, because I'm going to see it, so I don't really need to know every bit of information that comes down the stream as we're hearing about it. But as a podcaster, I probably should know something. But I'm sure, because I mean, you have Cap over there, Bucky's over there. As far as we know, half the Avengers, most of the Avengers are over there hanging out. At least they were at the end of Civil War. So we'll see how that ties into anything. But I'm sure we're going to get at least small cameos. I mean, if Iron Man is going to be such a big part of Spider-Man's movie,
so excited.
Surely Captain America will be at least a small part of Black Panther's movie.
Yeah, you would think so. They really just started kind of bleeding into each other's movies at this point, which is
I'm fine with
awesome.
every superhero movie in the Marvel Universe from now on being an Avengers movie.
Yeah.
In one way or another.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I was pumping my fist last year after I saw Civil War.
Yeah.
So
So good. So good. I'm very excited. You should all be excited about Black Panther. And while you are being so excited about Black Panther, please enjoy this segment that we're now going to bring you. In our segment for this episode, we have Alistair Stephens of Point North Media returning to give us his People's History of Comics. All right, we are here with Alistair Stephens of Point North Media for another segment of People's History of Comics. How are you doing today, Alistair?
I'm doing just fine, Vinton. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's dive into these questions and find out your history with comics. First question we have is, how did you get into comics, and what's the first comic you remember reading as a child?
I grew up in the northeast of Scotland, and my stepfather was in the Royal Air Force, so I moved around a lot and didn't have any kind of local comic shop. I don't even know where my local comic shop would have been in the northeast of Scotland in the mid-1980s, late 1980s. So I remember buying weird magazine format collections of Spider-Man stories, and occasionally, the blessed day when you would find an X-Men story in there. I devoured them. I loved them and had no sense at all of the broader continuity. I had no sense at all of the 616. I had no sense at all of even really the history of comics. These were just stories that appeared and I adored them. And alongside those, I read a number of comics in like the British comic tradition, the comedy comic tradition, the Beano, the Dandy, you know, weird little gag strips and things like that. So I read voraciously, but it wasn't until the early 90s. It wasn't until 92 or 93 that I really started reading, that I really started collecting and got bit by the bug. I was so hard into the X-Men at that time because of the sprawling continuity, because there are a million characters and I can find out about all of them and be the most popular kid on the playground. Weirdly,
or
that didn't happen.
Of that.
Yeah. Girls don't really,
go 20, 30 years ahead and maybe.
Exactly. This is what I'm saying. I'm a man out of time. Back in the northeast of Scotland, there were very few people who were really interested in, Dazzler's backstory, for example.
So our second question, did you have a favorite comic series or character growing up? And has that changed currently?
I can divide my comic reading history into basically two parts.
Okay.
There was the part where I read Spider-Man, and there was the part where I read X-Men. And X-Men for me is still today the corner of the Marvel Universe that speaks most eloquently to me because of the astonishing cast of characters, because of the depth of the continuity, because of the tangle of the continuity. And I think that through the years, basically most, if not all, of the most talented Marvel writers have worked on an X-Men title. I came up reading X-Men through the 90s, where these comics were not always good. They were not always great, but they were always ambitious.
That's true.
And kind of that just seeped into my bloodstream. So now when I think of comics, my mental image is still, the X-Men Blue Team. It is still, it's still something.
It's iconic.
Really iconic, really powerful. And those are the stories that I go to. Prior to that, Spider-Man. And Spider-Man, I think, luckily, I get to choose. I get to have my favorite solo hero and then my favorite team. And that's how I split it up. Those are the characters that speak to me. Peter Parker, I will have argued at length in bars, is one of the great literary creations of all time. He is not just, I would say, the best comics character, the single best comics character, but he stands up there with characters from literature, from film, from really any genre that you like, any medium that you like. Peter Parker is such a perfectly poised, such a balanced study of heroism and tragedy. He is so beautifully depicted. I mean, at his best. Of course, there have been terrible Spider-Man stories too through the years, but at his very best, he is exactly what you need in a Marvel style hero.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like we're the same person when it comes to comics. We started reading comics. Well, when you said you actually got deep into it in the early 90s, we both started there. I mean, when I first started reading, it was with comics pretty much. I mean, I barely knew how to read when I started picking up comics at a friend's house. His dad had long boxes of comics, and I was reading 70s and 80s X-Men and Spider-Man. and Spider-Man and X-Men are my teams. That's like
Yep.
X-Men's my team and Spider-Man's my character. So yeah,
There it is.
we
were
right
always
there.
destined to be friends.
That's right. So third question, and this one's kind of a big one. So dive into it as deep as you want, or keep it as surface level as you want. How have comic books affected you? And is there a comic arc that has had a big impact on you?
There are actually a few. I would count a few different comic arcs as being personally important, like important to my personal development.
Right.
I am the person I am today because of the comics that I've read. The thing that I love about comic book stories, about superhero stories in particular, is the way in which mythology weaves together these disparate elements and unifies them into something whole. It's oftentimes been said that superhero comics are like modern mythology. This is akin to the tales of ancient Greece or the tales of ancient Rome or the ancient Norse legends. I think that's absolutely true. I think at their best, superhero stories can absolutely illuminate what it is to strive for heroism, what it is to falter when you're trying to be a good person. They speak to morality in a way that isn't necessarily heavy-handed or didactic. They can be genuinely, I think, revelatory. And there have been a number of stories that have just absolutely touched me. But weirdly, that is not, when I think of how comics have changed my life, that is not where I go. The single comic that has changed my life more than any other is Ultimate Spider-Man, written by Brian Michael Bendis.
It's pretty good.
It's a fantastic series. I would put that entire run, that, I don't know, 140 issues or whatever it is, up against pretty much any run you care to name in comics history. But more importantly, that was my introduction to the Ultimate Universe. And the idea that these texts weren't just fluid within the pages of a comic or within the pages of a trade. They didn't just change. They weren't just built upon a raft of retcon. You could take a story and purposefully adapt it and run it parallel to the original story and have those two stories in a weird way speak to each other. That was the moment that I became fascinated with adaptation as an art, as a craft, as a discipline.
Yeah.
And I have spent now the last 6 years of my life talking on the internet about adaptation. I oftentimes talk about the ways in which stories are transformed in the retelling. Stories can be distilled in the retelling, which is a really interesting thing. The way that Ultimate Spider-Man took this incredibly convoluted backstory and focused it down and produced, I mean, okay, maybe I wouldn't put the entire run up against anything you care to name, but I would say those first 12 issues are pretty pitch perfect. So that is literally, I have the job that I have today. I started the business that I started because of Ultimate Spider-Man. And someday I will high five Brian Michael Bendis for it.
Well, that's awesome to dive into that history and see how much of an impact that had on you. Speaking of adaptation, that brings us right to our next question, which is, do you have a favorite comic book movie or TV show? And you can pick one of each if you want.
No, I really do. This is perhaps an odd one because I think that my favorite comic book movie is not, as people might expect, one of the MCU movies. It's not, the classic Richard Donner Superman. I generally love superhero movies. I think my threshold for enjoying superhero movies is perhaps a little lower than most people's because pretty much I'll watch anything. Pretty much I'll genuinely enjoy anything. I'm a defender of the first, I guess not first, but I'm a defender of the Chris Evans Fantastic Four movie. The first one.
Okay.
The second one really is terrible. But the first one is like, it's kind of okay. It's kind of fine. It's okay. It's all right.
I remember not enjoying it, but I remember actually finding some bit of things I could like in the second one because I liked Silver Surfer in it.
Sure,
but
Silver
that
Surfer
was
is
really
very cool.
It was like Spider-Man 3, where I was like, yeah, I liked Sandman in it. I liked Silver Surfer in it.
Sure. And here I am talking about superhero comics, talking specifically about Marvel, but my favorite adaptation, my favorite comic book movie isn't a superhero story. It certainly isn't a Marvel story. It is 2010 Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Oh man, it is good.
Based on the graphic novel series by Brian Lee O'Malley. That is, no kidding, one of my favorite movies ever, regardless of origin, regardless of source. And I get that it is not accessible to very many people in the world, but I am its specific target. That book, the book certainly, and the movie even more so, could have been written for me and just brought to my house on a DVD, and I would have loved it. So I will watch that, a couple of times a year.
Wow.
Just, as restoration, just as a way of sinking back into the story that I just adore so much. So yeah, Scott Pilgrim versus the World, directed by Edgar Wright in 2010.
Yeah. I mean, Edgar Wright is wonderful and makes really good movies 9 times out of 10. And Scott Pilgrim really spoke to me as well because my two aesthetics are punk rock and comic books.
Right.
And that musical side of that movie was just so perfect. I love the music that they played. It made me want to play in a band again every time I hear it, even. And just, so aesthetically pleasing for me. The animation in it, just the weird stylized things that they do in that film are so perfect. And I read all the comics as well, and the comics take a bit of a turn from the movie because the movie came out just before they were actually finished writing the comics. But I think I enjoyed the movie even more than the comics and that's so rare that actually happens.
No, they're very, very close. I think I really do love the comics. There's more depth there, but I think you're right. Some of that depth also gets mired in a kind of narrative ambiguity. It isn't always easy to completely distill Brian Lee O'Malley's intent in that book.
Right.
I would also recommend Brian Lee O'Malley's follow-up to Scott Pilgrim's Seconds, which is a standalone graphic novel.
I've been wanting to check that out. I've heard it's really good.
I have it. If you don't have it somewhere here in your capacious shelves.
I don't think I do.
I will lend it to you. It's extremely good.
Awesome. So, a cruel deity is about to destroy every comic in the world. This is one of my favorite questions that we borrowed from the show that we borrowed this segment from the Good Trash Media Network. You get to save 5 story arcs. And this can be loose. We keep it as story arc, so you can't say I save every Spider-Man comic.
Every Spider-Man
but you could save like all of Y the Last Man or something like that. We can play it fast and loose. You get to save 5 story arcs. What do you choose?
Well, having discussed my love of Spider-Man, I have to pick a Spider-Man comic. So I will pick Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut, which I think is... I was talking earlier about how Peter Parker is like a pitch perfect character, and I think that is maybe the story that distills that best. This is why Peter Parker is a hero, and it has nothing to do with his powers. It's completely fantastic. That's Amazing Spider-Man 229 to 230, written by Roger Stern. And the art by John Romita Jr. is so good.
I love those issues.
Yeah,
it's really great.
Just
I went
fantastic.
back and reread it just I think 2 or 3 months ago, even because
that's
it
even
came
more
up again. And I was
recently
like,
than me,
man, I haven't read that in a while, and I really remember enjoying it. So
on the other end of the spectrum, and moving to my other favorite, I guess, moving to the X-Men, I have to pick an X-Men story. It has to be, if this is something that I'm choosing that is representative of my peak love for the X-Men. I mean, there are a couple of choices. I would personally maybe swing toward the first Joss Whedon arc. I think that is some damn fine comics writing.
Yeah.
However, because I was reading the X-Men in the mid and late 90s, because that was the peak of my passion for the X-Men, and because that is a time of some truly terrible stories, I'm going to go to the most excessive, most hyperbolic, most bombastic story that I think the X-Men have ever done. I want the entire Age of Apocalypse.
Oh.
Which is 1,000,000 comics.
Yeah.
And it might seem weird to pick an entirely, or I guess now, of course, quasi-canonical version of the X-Men, this summer project where the entire X-Men line was suspended and new characters were created in this alternate universe, and they were wild and maddening and beautiful and frantic. And it was that was the moment, I think, when I was deepest into X-Men lore. I got every single one of those issues, and I would do but this means this, and these two things are obviously the same. And I speculated. Had I been on the internet at that time, luckily I wasn't, or it would have just destroyed my entire life for 4 months. Had I been on the internet at that time, I would have been talking theories over on some Usenet page. But it exemplifies 90s comics to me, and in a way that honestly and unironically warms my heart, exemplifies the X-Men to me.
Yeah, that whole run of X-Men comics did a lot of canon bending, a lot of things that when you try to explain it to someone, they go, but I thought that, and you go, well, X-Men. I think it's been the subject of many of Jay and Miles, their Explain the X-Men podcast, cold opens where they try to explain what happened, and then one of them just screams, what?
I love Jay and Miles.
Yeah.
It's a great show.
I was just thinking about what I would pick if I was going to pick an X-Men run from there, and you were talking about the 90s, and I was like, yeah, what really brought it in for me? It wasn't the 90s comics. It was when Grant Morrison came in and fixed the 90s comics with new X-Men. I was like, yeah, I really got into that series because he just like really was like, I'm going to course correct some of this. Yeah. Now, of course, he went off the rails at the end of that series as well. But then Joss Whedon came in and was like, I'm going to course correct some of this. And so I feel like that's just the story of comics. Someone writes X-Men until they run it off the rails, and someone else comes in and goes, I got to course correct.
That famous line, every political career ends in tragedy.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel the same way about comics runs. If you can write your run and get out, X-Men is the worst. Yes, you're absolutely right. The third story that I would save actually speaks to my roots in comic reading in Britain, because at the time I was a huge fan of 2000 AD and Judge Dredd. One of the stories that I would definitely save, and one of the stories that has touched me and moved me, and I think forced me to be a better person, helped me to be a better person in my life, is a story called America, which appeared in, I think, the first 7 issues of the Judge Dredd magazine in 1990. It is Judge Dredd as a series is famous for its bombast. It is famous for being so much larger than life and so very exaggerated that it turns satire. It almost inverts satire. It is so heavy-handed that it almost stops being a parody of this, this East Coast police state, and becomes instead something sincere. It becomes instead something that you can actually emotionally connect with. This story strips all of that away. The judges are barely in the story. It focuses on a young man named Bennett Beanie and the girl that he loves, America. Over the course of the story, Bennett's life doesn't work out. America's life doesn't work out. We see what happens when a totalitarian regime crushes hope, even when that totalitarian regime is doing its best, is trying to protect as many people as possible. When you see the loss of justice and the loss of mercy and the loss of hope, this is what happens to people. It is absolutely heartbreaking. And then the turn right at the end of the final issue, I won't spoil it, I still get chills thinking about it.
Wow.
That was actually, I think, the first time I read that in 1990. So I would have been 12 years old. That was the first time that I remember being actually shocked, actually stunned, actually like put the book down and walk away from it. I cannot deal with this emotionally right now. It's incredible. I've read it many, many times over the years, and it really, really stands up. That's America from the first 7 issues of the Judge Dredd magazine, but it's collected in a trade. It's really lovely.
Judge Dredd is something I've always wanted to get into. I haven't heard of that series particular of Judge Dredd, but that sounds fascinating. I've always felt this barrier between me and Judge Dredd because it looks amazing. The things I've seen and read about it are amazing, but there's so much bad Judge Dredd out there, and really it's so hard to figure out what's good, what's bad, and like regulate what you take in. And there's so much out there, even just because it ran for so long and so many different formats that I don't know where to start. I don't know where to go. And so that gave me an in. I can now jump into Judge Dredd through that. Have you read Tokyo Ghost before?
I haven't.
This is a comic that I've read, and everything that I think that Judge Dredd is going to be for me, I saw in this comic. So I might have to let you check it out and see what you think and if that's true or not.
That would be I'm always fascinated by the response of American readers to 2000 AD because it feels like such a British comic.
Yeah.
It's so very specific in its reference, and has become, I think, no less specific over the years. It's been a couple of years. It's been 4 or 5 years, I think, since I've picked up an issue of 2000 AD, but it is still provocative and challenging. And I think you would love it. It has that really edgy punk rock aesthetic, and it's never lost that. It has never transformed itself into something more accessible, into something more approachable. It's always just a little ragged, just a little, slap in the face as you open it up. So yeah, I think you'd be into it.
That's me, punk rock and comics. If anything touches on those 2 things, I will probably want to check it out.
Yeah.
So
the fourth story that I would save, the fourth story that I would preserve in amber, that I would bury in a time capsule, that I would want preserved for all time, is the first volume of Brian K. Vaughan's Runaways. I think Runaways is an astonishing series. Brian K. Vaughan is a fantastic writer. The first volume is very nearly perfect. I think in terms of its narrative, in terms of its ambition, in terms of its scope, in terms of the way in which it plays in the margins of the 616 universe, really speaks to me. It really communicates to me. And it does something that very rarely in comics you will get something that feels as though it should always have existed and somehow didn't.
Yeah.
I don't know how we got to Runaways before someone wrote Runaways.
Yeah, I agree.
I love it.
Yeah, I love Runaways so much. And that's been something that I've been wanting to jump back to even before the show was announced. But now that the show's been announced, I'm like, I gotta jump back and reread these issues because I haven't read them since they came out. I was reading them when the issues were coming out.
Wow.
And I haven't read it since then.
I only ever read it in trade, and I'm glad that I did because I could not have waited for single issues on that. And I would almost expand it to encompass the second volume too. I think the second volume is 98% of where the first volume is. So if I can stretch the rules here.
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
include both.
Sure.
Yes, first 12 issues of that run. And then the last one is kind of a turn and kind of harkens back to my fascination with stories and with myths and with the way in which stories are told and retold. And for me, the most interesting example of that in comic book storytelling, and one of the first that I encountered, and certainly one of the first that I thought about critically, and this is something that I want to think about critically again in the future, in the near future, in public. Hey, pointnorthmedia.com, go check it out. Is Crisis on Infinite Earths. I'm not a huge DC guy.
Right.
But the audacity of writing a story that rewrites all stories, the audacity of rebuilding your universe in fiction, because this wasn't the first reboot. This wasn't the first kind of clearing of the decks that comic books had seen, but it was the first time that anyone tried to take a completely anarchic multiverse, or not even a multiverse, but fragments of multiverses, and fold them into one unified narrative, and doing that through a story. Every time I read Crisis on Infinite Earths, it completely takes my breath away. It's so stupidly ambitious. It is so stupidly complex. It is so beautifully well executed. And it contains the entire foundation. Even after reboot after reboot after reboot, I still think you can divide the DC universe into pre and post Crisis.
Yeah.
That's the way that it is. And Crisis is, God, I could talk about this all day. I'm not going to. But the way that it speaks about apocalypse myths, the way that it speaks about creation myths, the way that it speaks about unity and diversity of identity, the way in which we can be different people and yet be the same person. It's staggering. It's a work of genius. I can't recommend it highly enough, though I would strongly recommend reading it in company. I would strongly recommend getting a bunch of people together to read it, or getting one of the beautiful annotated editions that contain all of the references. It's because it is just so complex.
Oh, I didn't know they had an annotated version. Well, I guess I know what's going to go on my Amazon
good.
wish list when this is done. I love annotated anything.
Me too.
Our next question. You can have drinks with one comic character. The character, not the actor who may have played them or the historical person that they may be based on. Who do you pick?
I think that there is only one answer to this question. Because, you might want to hang out with Bruce Wayne, but I suspect you don't really. And you might want to hang out with Clark Kent, but I suspect you don't really. For me, the only possible answer to this question, and this has been my answer since I first read, Avengers comics back in the day, it has to be Tony Stark, right? Specifically because you said you go out for a drink with. If this was have tea with Professor Charles Xavier, perhaps. That would be interesting. That would be edifying. Reed Richards would be edifying too. If for nothing else, then you get to question what it is that he thinks he's doing most of the time. But it has to be Tony Stark. Go to a bar with Tony Stark. That would be an unforgettable and possibly fatal evening.
Yeah, you're pushing him off the wagon, I think, depending on which Tony Stark you're going with.
Drink ginger ale. He'll be fine. But he also knows what to order. And that's
Shirley Temple. It's a good answer. I like that answer. It would be fascinating. There's so many different ways to go about answering that question. I think that was a really good one. So many times it's like you want to dive into, what conversations do I want to have? Just recently we had someone say that, well, if I'm okay with dying during the evening, I would pick Constantine. I think when it comes to comic book characters, you often have to think of that. Like, well, am I going to survive this evening?
That would be a grim night, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Sitting down with John Constantine. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Yeah.
So our last question for you is the easy one.
Mm-hmm.
What's the last comic that you read?
The last comic I read was recommended to me by you for our Excelsior podcast over on commonroomradio.com. We just read Tim King's Vision series, all 12 issues of that, and it is completely extraordinary, and no one listening to this podcast needs to hear me say that, because I'm sure they've heard you say it. I'm sure they've heard 50 other people say it. It's a knockout. It impressed me in so many ways, on so many levels. It is deft, and it is acute, and it is rich. It is literary comic storytelling at its best. I can't recommend it highly enough.
I agree. And by the time that you're hearing this, that will be up on our Excelsior feed. Go check it out.
Yeah, you've got just enough time. Go get both volumes of Vision, read them, fix your broken heart, just try and drag yourself together, run a comb through your hair, just try and get back to a semblance of humanity, and then you can listen to our podcast, in which we'll break your heart all over again.
Yes, absolutely. So we've come to the end of our questions. Where can people find you online, and tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
I talk about stories and storytelling over at pointnorthmedia.com. I have a couple of seminars running now, including one on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and starting today as we record this, one on American Gods by Neil Gaiman, both the novel and the upcoming Starz TV adaptation. That is how I spend my days. That is what I do. I basically talk into a microphone for a living, and it's a pretty good gig. You can also find me on Twitter at Paper Bullets, where I tweet frequently and recklessly on a great many subjects.
And we do, like we mentioned, the Excelsior podcast together. So go check that out. It's on Twitter at Excelsior Cast. It's on iTunes. It's on YouTube. It may even be on more things by the time you're hearing this, because I know that we're trying to get it on Stitcher and Google Play as well.
That will happen,
we
yes.
talk about comic book media, movies, TV shows, and comics themselves. We take an episode and dive into a story, whether it's a season, a movie, or a volume of a comic book. And we talk about the story, the structure. We talk about what we liked, what didn't work, and any behind the scenes anecdotes that we can find. So
it's conversational, it's insightful, it's a ton of fun, is what it is.
Yeah.
We get to record it in the wonderful company of Sarah Kate Pazant,
yes,
who is just a delight.
Yeah.
A more enthusiastic and expressive and passionate lover of comic book stories you will never find. She's
That's right.
just a delight. So.
Yeah, we've had her on Read Brave a few times before, and hopefully a lot more in the past. So she is absolutely fantastic. And if you've heard her on the show before and enjoyed her, you will absolutely love Excelsior.
I recommend it.
I highly recommend it. 5 out of 5 stars. Would podcast again.
Good, because I think we're recording one tomorrow.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. All right. Thank you so much for joining us again. It was great to learn your history of comics, and hope to have you on again soon.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Anytime, let me know. Shine a bat signal. I'll be here.
All right. See ya. All right, so that was our segment, and we are back to give recommendations. Emily, do you have a recommendation for us?
Yes. Obviously, I recommend Hawkeye with Kate Bishop by Kelly Thompson. It's kind of fantastic. She references all sorts of things like Julie Andrews and Jessica Jones makes an appearance. So I was there.
If you like Jessica Jones, any of her comics, Alias, Pulse, or if you like the Mockingbird series by Chelsea Kane, both of those I think are spiritually connected to Hawkeye. They really carry the same spirit in the comics, the same type of jokes, the same type of powerful women, the more not childlike comic for women. I would say, like, because very often if you have a female comic, you get Miss Marvel, and not to say that Miss Marvel is like something that is done as like a pattern. Miss Marvel is totally unique in itself, but what you don't get very often is the adult-centered female superhero.
Yeah.
And so here you have that, and it's not a female superhero written for men to ogle over like
Yeah,
you often
no.
got in the 80s and the 90s.
No, if anything, she's ogling over abs all
Yes.
over the first issue.
So in that same way, it's like Mockingbird. And so if you like either of those things, then you will probably love Hawkeye.
Yes. And I was told to read Unstoppable Wasp by Sarah
Yes.
on Friday night.
Unstoppable
Also
Wasp is
told.
another one that is it's actually more child oriented, but there's a lot of really cool things in there and a lot of really smart writing.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And also, it's kind of off the beaten path, but I forgot to mention this in my recently read, but I just read Girl Over Paris, which is a graphic novel by Gwenda Bond. Well, I guess based on the story by Gwenda Bond and Kate Leth, I'm pretty sure.
Ooh.
And it is a follow-up to Gwenda Bond's novels about the Cirque Americaine, which I read because previous segmenter Josh Unruh has recommended strongly basically everything Gwenda Bond. So I've read, I think, everything
Nice.
she's written or working on it. So that was an interesting graphic novel as a follow-up to a book, which I've read a couple of mangas as follow-ups to books before. And it's really interesting to see what can be done in different medium.
For sure.
So,
well, my recommendation for this episode is Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man, the new series by Chip Zdarsky. This is everything I want from a Spider-Man comic. Most recently, as I mentioned, this has been kind of a Spider-Man heavy episode, I have been feeling a little worn out with Spider-Man. Him being my favorite hero, like I said, am often let down by the comics produced. And that's not to say that they're bad. They're just not what I want from a Spider-Man comic. That's not what I go to for what I really enjoy with Spider-Man. This was a breath of fresh air for Spider-Man, and it's exactly what I needed to get back into it, to get me hyped back up, because I've been struggling in my Spidey fandom, and I'm feeling completely revitalized already after one issue. I love this, and Zdarsky is completely killing it. There's so many good small jokes. This is exactly what you need with the Spider-Man title. There's a moment where he's talking to Ant-Man, and Ant-Man says, "You're the only guy I know to have so many senior citizen enemies." And Spidey says, "They're always trying to buy me off with their deep discounts and dusty cookies." This is what I want from Spider-Man, guys. It's why Spidey was so great, because he was just street level hanging out. And Zdarsky even makes jokes about how, be sure to check out that other Spider-Man title, our younger sister, the weaker of the Spider-Man titles. It's like, that's the main one. So this is so I like that he's making that joke, because that's now how I feel. This is my main Spider-Man title, and I hope that it doesn't just last 5 issues, tell a story, and get canceled when the movie comes out, because I feel like that's probably what's going to happen. But it's doing what I want with Spider-Man, so please don't let that happen.
I'll have to add it to my to-read list.
It's fantastic. And there's only 1 issue out right now, so good time to catch up.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It just came out, I think, last Wednesday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that is going to do it for this episode. Emily, where can people find you online if they want to talk with you about comics?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Saviem01. That's SAVIEM01. So, yeah, I post a lot of pictures of comics that I'm reading on Instagram every once in a while. Also, my knitting and my fingernail polish,
which is also fantastic.
But yeah, and I am all nerdy and everything like that on Twitter. So,
and as always, you can find me on Twitter to talk to me about comics at Flesh Eater. Make sure to check out the Read Brave Instagram at Read Brave Comics. Check us out on Twitter at Read_Brave. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Graphocast and the whole Graphomania podcast network. And make sure to rate and review us on iTunes so other people can find us. And please talk to us about comics, because we always like to talk about comics any way that you want to. On Twitter, on Instagram, you can email us, contact@graphocast.com, or leave comments on the website. That's Graphocast, GRAPHOCAST.com. Until next time, I'm Vinton Bain.
And I'm Emily Savidge.
And I have no outro line. Goodbye.
I wasn't sure if I was supposed to say my name there.
You were.
Okay, good.
You did it. Keeping all this in.
Oh my
This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com. Follow us on Twitter at Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.